So I am continuing in this series of Friday night sermons based on my sense of how I have learned and grown over these past 40 years as a rabbi. And tonight I want to talk about immortality and afterlife and death to some extent. And looking back, having been ordained in 1980 from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, I was 30 years old. What did I know? What did I know about afterlife or death or any of those things? If I had been at a Catholic seminary, and I'm sure my wife is happy that I wasn't, but if I had been at a Catholic seminary, we would have been studying heaven and hell and purgatory and limbo, and there was a whole theology built around the afterlife, about redemption and resurrection, about sin, about reward and punishment. And when I first began my rabbinate, I would often meet with interfaith couples, and typically the non-Jewish partner would say to the Jewish partner, well, what does Judaism say about the afterlife, about death, and what comes afterwards? And the Jewish partner would say, I don't know. We never talked about that. And I have to tell you, I'm not so sure I was very much help to those people, because, in fact, it was never a central idea in my training. Oh, there was some discussion of what Jacob meant when he said that he would go down with his white hair into Sheol to be with his fathers. Or when Joseph, again, said, make sure that I am buried with my fathers, my mothers, in the generations. In rabbinics, later on in Talmud, there's some discussion of what's called the yeshiva shamala. In other words, the study house on high. What the rabbis saw as the afterlife was that they would be able to continue studying in their study halls, except instead of on earth, in heaven. But it was never kind of so well worked out as it is in parts, certainly, of Christian theology. It's not central to Jewish thought. My good friend, Rabbi Eric Yaffe, who was the president of the Union for Reform Judaism, said at the time of his own retirement that he was not sure he believed in life after death, he just believed in life before death, which is why he was retiring. And that is somewhat insightful, because even Buber said, Judaism is about the here and now. It's not about the afterlife. Now, the day of my bar mitzvah, when I was 13, that Saturday morning, going to synagogue, reading from Torah, but in that evening, it was my grandfather's yortzeit. So my father and his brothers all went for the yortzeit to an Orthodox synagogue nearby. I believe it was Rabbi Yechiel Pupko's father's synagogue, but I can't be sure if Rabbi Pupko was the one teaching that night. But I went with them because now I was a bar mitzvah. I made up part of the minyan, and I'll never forget the story that the rabbi told in the tish, the tabletop discussion after the service. He told a story that I then have used myself and published in this book about heaven and hell. It's a simple story. A righteous man goes to heaven, having died. He's welcomed into heaven and given one gift, one choice, and one wish. And he says, well, I'm kind of surprised I'm here in heaven. I never expected that. But it would mean a lot more to me if I could compare it with what hell's like. And so sure enough, they temporarily sent him down to hell so he could see what hell was like. And he walks into this great room, a banquet hall, and there's this long table filled with wonderful food, every imaginable food you could think of, with the aromas wafting up, and he's starving for this wonderful food, and he looks at the people, and they're all wan and pale, and they're starving. And he tries to figure out why, and there are people seated on either side of the table, and he notices that everyone has a long wooden spoon attached to above their elbow, and they can reach the food, but they can't feed themselves. He says that's a pretty good metaphor for what hell's like. So he goes back up to heaven, and he enters heaven, and he walks into the same exact banquet hall with all the same food and all the same aromas, and the people are satisfied and happy and wonderful. And he looks, and they too have these long wooden spoons attached to their arms above the elbow, but they're sitting across from each other and feeding each other. So that was this humanistic understanding of what heaven and hell was. We make our own heavens and our own hells, and it's what we do that allows that to happen. And so I've always loved that story, and so therefore published it in this book. But it is wrong to dismiss Jewish thought as if it has no role in the concept of afterlife. Rabbi Neil Gilman, who taught at Jewish Theological Seminary, wrote a very important book in the year 2000 called The Death of Death, which is about Jewish thoughts on death, afterlife, and resurrection. And he goes through Jewish tradition and says there absolutely is this belief in the afterlife and resurrection, even in physical, bodily resurrection at the time of the Messiah. That when the Messiah comes in the Messianic age, people will have bodily resurrection. At least that is part of Jewish tradition. It's not terribly emphasized. It is emphasized, by the way, among Chabad. Chabad believes that more or less the world in which we live is only a temporary world and an illusion, and the real world is in the world to come. But that's not mainstream. And even Maimonides said that the idea of resurrection was really a spiritual resurrection, not a physical one. So when we were reading the second blessing of the Amidah in the Gevurot, I said pay attention to what was in the brackets in the parentheses, because when one of the key aspects of classical Reform Judaism from Germany on was to change the prayer in that specific prayer, which says, Mechaye Meitim, who gives life to the dead. That was something that the rationalists, the scientific thinkers of the 19th century absolutely could not accept. So they changed that word from Mechaye Meitim, who gives life to the dead, to Mechaye Hakol, who brings life to all. Back when Mishkan Tefillah was happening, there were elements within the Reform movement, within the Reform liturgical world, that wanted to return back to the more traditional. And there was a battle that went on, and they couldn't agree. So naturally, they couldn't agree, so they put in both versions, so that you have a choice of saying Mechaye Meitim or Mechaye Hakol. I have to tell you, I fought that battle for Hakol, for all, and I was very much against putting in who gives life to the dead. But that kind of defines a bit the kind of conflict that exists within modern Reform. But even understanding Mechaye Meitim, who gives life to the dead, I can understand that only in terms of metaphor or symbolism. And it remains not the mainstream concept within Judaism. But at the same time, as I grew as a rabbi, I dealt with death a great deal. And I certainly dealt with the death of my own parents. And one of the ways I understood their death was a sense of eternality. There's something that lasts. There is something that is forever and ever. And it is that which is kind of defeats the nature of death. That I had written a sermon called The Empty Chair that talked about the story of David and his closest friend Jonathan. And Jonathan says to David, there's a banquet coming up. Your chair will be empty. You will be missed. And I used that idea to say that at our Passover Seders, at our Hanukkah dinners, at birthdays and anniversaries, the people who we've been closest to over time, oftentimes that chair is empty. There is metaphorically a chair at the table where we feel their spiritual presence, and that spiritual presence stays with us even when the physical is not there. And so this idea of what is eternal, what lasts, continued to be influential in my way of thinking. But in thinking about death itself, I think it was very important always to look at death not as punishment or reward. And so I've often emphasized at the high holidays the prayer Untitled Chapter, which is very problematic for many people because it says that there is a God who has this book of life and determines who's going to live and who's going to die, who by water, who by fire, who by thirst, who by hunger, who by wild beast. And it appears to be reward punishment. And I've rejected that and said that what it says is it's going to be something. It's going to be something. It's going to be fire or water, hunger or thirst. It's going to be heart or cancer. It's going to be something that's going to happen to us. And it's not a reward or punishment. It is what happens. It is the reality. And then in Untitled Chapter, it says, U'teshuva, u'tefila, u'tzedakah, ma'avirin et roach zeira, but repentance, prayer, and charity tempers the bitterness of what happens. And so that we have power, we have control over what we do with prayer, repentance, charity. We have control over that. We may not have control over all the things that may happen to us, or whether it happens next year or in 20 years or in 30 years, but we do have control over the choices we make in life. One of the most influential books, certainly in my thinking, was by Harold Kushner, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And it was when bad things happen to good people. That theology of this is what happens in the world, and now what are you going to do with it? And I think what I've noticed in these past 30 years for sure is that the role that hospice has played, and it really, hospice influence is really about that same period of time. The understanding of what death means and how we accept death. And one of the things that taught me the most was about 6 weeks before my own mother's death, she emerged out of a nap, out of a back room, her bedroom where she was napping, came out and said, "This is the happiest time of my life." Now, in reading about hospice as well, that's not an unusual statement. What my mother meant by it was that this was a time she knew she was dying, but that her life made sense, that her life was fulfilled. She had achieved what she never expected to achieve in growing up in the Depression. And I don't mean just, material goods, but that her life worked, and so she was happy. And one of my favorite stories is the death of my father. My father was dying, and I came into Pittsburgh to visit, and my sister was there, and my brother already lived there, my mother was there. And so when my sister picked me up from the airport, naturally the first thing we did was we stopped at the deli on the way in so we would have some lunch. And I go in and visit my father, come back into the kitchen, we start having lunch, and my father calls out from the bedroom and says, "What's going on?" We said, "We're having lunch." He says, "What are you having?" He said, "Corned beef sandwich." He said, "Bring me some." So we cut up about this much of a corned beef sandwich for him, brought it to him. He said, "What else?" We said, "Well, there are pickles." He said, "Bring me some." So again, about this much of pickle we brought him. And then maybe a couple soup spoons of matzo ball soup. And then he wanted to know what was for dessert, and we had Rocky Road ice cream. So he had his Rocky Road ice cream with his corned beef and matzo ball and pickle. And I said to my father, "You know, you're not dying, you're pregnant." Well, there's a part of this death process, afterlife process, that really is birth. And as my father was lying there with also, giving him some water, some ice water, what we used, we ran out of the little sponges, we used some gauze, just dipping the gauze in the ice water. And I'm thinking, this is what we do at a bris. And I know so many of you have dealt with death very close up. And if you think about it, there's so many ways in which it really is infancy. That we deal with someone dying in the way we deal with an infant. And so in that way, I think there's this feeling that there's a birth process going on. So a birth process is also the creation process. And let me more or less conclude with the creation story itself, because I think it explains my theology about death and afterlife as well as anything I know. And it's a story of the creation of humans, Adam, man, human, from Adamah, from earth. Earthling from earth, human from humus, and then God forms the earth stuff and breathes into the earth stuff, Ruach Elohim, breath of God. And that's what animates us. And when we die, the breath leaves, and we're left with the clay earth vessel. But the breath never dies. The breath is the wind. The breath is the ruach. There's no more wind today than there ever was in all of history. That's never changed. And that our breath is eternal. And that when I say that there is eternality, that's what I mean. That there is something that lives on after us and continues after us that may not be physical, but is very much there. And when we talk about the breath of God being breathed into Adam, human, that's the beginning of the book of Genesis. That's the beginning of the Torah. The end of the Torah is the death of Moses. And Moses dies. And Moses has to die. Moses dies alone. But the rabbis say that when it came time for Moses to die, God took away his breath with a kiss. And that the breath returned back to God. That was the same breath as was breathed into Adam. And I really do understand personally that what is eternal is that divine spirit within us. And whether it is a physical eternality or a spiritual one or a metaphoric one, it is something that lasts, and I believe that who we are and what we do does last and has meaning and has significance and has permanence. And that's my concept of what is afterlife. Shabbat Shalom.